A very warm welcome to everyone present here. It is definitely a privilege and honor to commence the proceedings on behalf of the Department of Economics, St. Joseph's College of Commerce, along with Indian Behavioral Economics Network, IBEN, Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, Indian Institute of Management, Indian Institute of Technology, Madras, Fractal, and Beyond Nudge Consultancy. I wish to welcome participants to this unique and hopefully a tremendous learning experience for all of us. Behavioral economics and behavioral science is a very fascinating subject. However, when it is analyzed and studied as a manifestation of our behavior, it scales astounding heights. I'm sure that this fest, conducted in 3 parts, will give us an opportunity to prick the brains of the most renowned and established minds in this field. The first event, Fireside Chat with Dilip Soman, Behavioral Science, Then, Now, and the Future, is going to be presented now. It would go a long way to help quite a few of us to do further studies and research on the subject. I now request Reverend Father Charles Lasrado, SJ, Principal of SJCC Bangalore, to say a few words.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this fireside chat with Dr. Dilip Soman. About 15 years ago, when we experienced stock market meltdown worldwide, we were grappling as to what is the situation and how it arisen. We applied fundamental analysis, efficient market hypothesis, full employment theory, and ultimately, the behavioral sciences approach helped us to make sense of what had happened in 2008-9. Now it is generally accepted that behavioral sciences help us to make better decisions in the real world and understand things better. And as a result, we are able to design better policies, create more effective products and services, and the like. Recognizing the importance of behavioral sciences in our lives, St. Joseph's College of Commerce, in collaboration with Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, IBEN, Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, IIT Madras, Fractal, and Beyond Nudge Consultancy has designed the India Behavioral Economics Fest 2023. This fest has 3 events lined up, which will be spanning over 3 months. The first event is today's event, Fireside Chat with Dr. Dilip Soman. The second event will be coming in a couple of weeks from now, Nudgeathon, a behavioral science hackathon being hosted at Indian Institute of Science on the 12th of August. Then finally, we'll be having Tribe 23. Tribe is an acronym for the Research in Behavioral Economics conference, will be held at St. Joseph's College of Commerce on the 9th of September 2023. So over the next 50 days or so, we are going to have these 3 events starting from today's event. So I warmly welcome Dr. Dilip Soman, the main today's resource person, and all the participants for a fruitful session.
Thank you, Father. It gives me immense pleasure to introduce our guest for the day, Professor Dilip Soman. He is the Director of Behavioral Economics in Action Research Center, BEAR, Rotman, and holds the Canada Research Chair in Behavioral Science and Economics. His research focuses on the use of behavioral science in marketing, policy, and consumer well-being. In addition to teaching BE 101X Behavioral Economics in Action on edX, he is the author of The Last Mile, University of Toronto Press. Professor Soman teaches courses in behavioral economics, managing customer value, pricing, managerial decision making, and marketing strategy. His research interests are primarily in the area of behavioral economics, consumer behavior, spending and saving, mental accounting, sales promotion, and service management. A very warm welcome to you, sir. And I would like to hand over the session to you now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's a very kind introduction. Let me begin also by congratulating all of you for this initiative. It's fantastic that you're doing it. Bangalore has turned out to be the hub of behavioral activity in India, which is amazing. So all the best, and I hope this succeeds better than anything else that's ever succeeded in the past. So great stuff. Junafi asked me to speak about the past, the present, and the future. And so what I thought I would do is maybe spend a few minutes on the past and the present, and then outline a few things that I think will be challenges for the future. So I'm going to spend about 10 to 15 minutes outlining some of my thoughts, and then we will have plenty of time for discussion and questions and any other points on which you might want clarification. So I want to start off by saying that today I'm going to focus on applied behavioral science and not academic behavioral science. Academic behavioral science has been around forever. It's taken the form of cognitive psychology and social psychology. It's taken the form of sociology. It's taken the form of ethnography. I mean, it's been around in different manifestations for hundreds of years. But I think the part of the science that is now visible to most people, both in terms of practitioners and the lay public, is the applied part of the field. And I think it's fairly safe to say that that particular event was catalyzed by the book Nudge, which is now 15 years old. It was first published in 2008, written by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein. And the book did a lot for the field. I think not only did it make the field popular and understandable and relatable, but I think it also showcased the fact that behavioral science could be something that an organization, be it a for-profit organization or a not-for-profit or a government or anyone else, it's a science that can actually be harnessed effectively to help, the word that was used back in the book was nudge, people towards making better choices. And so I think in many ways, we tend to view the progress of our field as if it started in 2008. And the publication of Nudge was followed very quickly by a lot of other applied activities. So for example, in 2010, Prime Minister Cameron in the United Kingdom was instrumental in establishing the first behavioral unit in government. It was then called the Nudge Unit. Today, it's called the Behavioral Insights Team, and it is now no longer part of government. Shortly after that, Australia, Canada, and then later on, the United States also had teams working in governments, as today have, there are many other countries that do that. In the for-profit world, there were a lot of organizations that initially played with the concept of nudge. I think companies like Procter & Gamble, a lot of financial services firms. And it is now estimated that we have perhaps upward of 600 units that are applying behavioral science in all kinds of organizations. And I think what's fundamental to all of these organizations is the basic profound observation that every company, every government essentially exists with the goal of changing behavior. And so if you think about what companies do, I mean, yeah, they belong to different verticals and they belong to different industries and have different shapes and sizes. But at the end of the day, they're all looking at changing somebody's behavior. That somebody could be a customer. You want the customer to buy your product instead of the competitors, or you want them to buy the product more frequently. It could be an employee. You want to get people to sign up for pension plans or to participate in organizational culture initiatives. It could be absolutely any other stakeholder. And so given the centrality of behavioral science, it's actually not surprising that a lot of organizations have now gone ahead and embraced the importance of social science. But if you pause a little bit and think about a report card, you say, well, 600 units sounds pretty good. 21 countries have governments that are using behavioral science. But then we kind of compare that with the fact that there are an estimated 333 million companies in the world, and there are 195 different countries. Well, that's still a drop in the bucket, right? And so clearly we haven't made the kind of progress that we think we should have made given the importance of behavioral science. Also, looking back for the past 15 years or so, if you start thinking through the narrative, the tone of all of the writing in the field, it was more of what I call a cheerleading tone. Like we were advocating for the science. We were saying, look, isn't this amazing? Don't just focus on operational science. Don't just focus on traditional communication. Here's a different way to think about behavior change. And so it was essentially almost in the spirit of advertising the science, if you go back and look at the last 15 years. And I think the next decade or so, the next decade to 15 years, is going to look very different, right? And so I want to touch on 5 different things that I think will be the focus of our science as it is applied in organizations going forward. And I'll just briefly touch on each one of them. We can get into details on any of them as we get into discussion and Q&A. The first big thing that I think we need to tackle as a field is the translatability and the scalability of our findings. And what I mean by that is it is now abundantly clear that our findings in behavioral science are not as portable as findings in some other sciences. Now, note this is not surprising, right? Like our science itself makes the case that behavioral interventions or behaviors more generally are context dependent. And so if we take an intervention, if we take a particular finding that's worked really well in one country or one particular jurisdiction and take the same thing and apply it somewhere else, chances are good that you will not get the same level of success. And so that's what we mean by translation challenges, right? Obviously, they happen because of changes in context, but then the question is, what do we actually mean by context? And so we've got a little report that's going to be published in a week or so that identifies different elements of context. But in a nutshell, there are 2 buckets of things we need to think about. We need to think about the similarities or differences between the people who are going to be the recipients of our intervention in the original versus the new setting, right? Do they speak the same language? Are they in the same age group? Do they belong to the same socioeconomic status? Are they as interconnected or independent as each other? And so there's a number of things that are different or unique to every circumstance about the people whose behavior we are looking to change. But then there's also a bucket of things that have to do with the context, the situation in which the intervention is going to be delivered. So for example, the same reminder that is delivered to people on a mobile device versus via email has very different effects, right? It turns out that if the reminder is to encourage people to do something like get a flu vaccination or make a pension contribution, at least in one particular study, interventions sent on a mobile device are a lot more effective than interventions sent by email. Of course, this will depend on the email reading habits of the people in question. And that's what I mean by the fact that our findings are they're not as portable as we think they should be. So that's a huge challenge. Timing matters, season matters, physical location matters, whether the decision maker receives the communication while they're on their own or in the presence of family or in a crowd matters. Everything everything matters, right? And so translation becomes a challenge. Just because something has worked for somebody else doesn't mean it's going to work for you. And so we need to think about a better way in which we can help practitioners decide what's going to work in what situation. Similar challenge with scaling. When you take an intervention that has worked really well in a pilot study. So let's say you've done a pilot study where you've tried a reminder to get people to take a flu vaccination. You've done this with a sample size of about 5,000 or 10,000 people in one particular area code or zip code, and then you try and scale it up to the entire state. It turns out the overall effects that you get are going to be much weaker on average compared to what you got in the pilot. And so sometimes when we do pilots and we think, oh my God, we're going to be able to increase the number of people who get flu vaccinations by 20%. And then you scale it up and it's not 20% anymore, it's only about 3 or 4%. So that's the other thing we have to be careful of, thinking through what's a good, effective way of trying to scale intervention. So that's one set of challenges, translation and scaling. Second, preparing the organization, right? And what I mean by that is, after all, we are talking about behavioral science. Universities are set up to do science, companies are not. And one of the biggest frictions for companies to adopt behavioral science is their ability to do experiments, is their ability to collect quick data, to pivot in response to what you've learned, and so on and so forth, right? And so in one of our books, The Behaviorally Informed Organization, we talk about the notion of the cost of experimentation. That's something we need to drive down. That involves not just the physical cost of going out and collecting data and randomizing and doing the experiment, but also the mindset. Can we get people to think more experimentally? Can we build more humility within organizations? And so preparing the organization to be able to execute on the promise of behavioral science is another big challenge. Third one is moving the science from what I call the last mile to the first mile. So what's the last mile? The last mile is the point of time where the organization actually interfaces with the stakeholders whose behavior they're trying to change. And so in the case of marketing or sales, that would be your point of merchandising or your website or brochures that you might send out or communication materials, basically touch points, right? And so a lot of the work that's happened over the past 10 to 15 years has been at the last mile, right? Can we change the layout of the website? Can we change the way in which forms are structured? Can we change messaging using behavioral science? And I would love to see us move more and more upstream into the first mile. Can we use behavioral science to redesign the product design process, to reimagine the way we think about segmentation, to change our HR policy, and so on and so forth, right? And so there's a lot of work to be done in bringing behavioral science from just this thing that we do to optimize our existing system to a science that will fundamentally change the way we run our organization and we sell our products and we manage our employees. Okay. Fourth, I do think we need to broaden the substantive areas or the substantive domains on which this science can have an impact. But at the same time, we have to be a little bit humble in saying that this science alone isn't going to have an impact on really consequential problems. So think about climate change. It's obviously a huge problem. It is an existential problem. Think about gun control or violence more generally in the United States or elsewhere in the world. Think about problems like the retirement crisis or the financial crisis that we alluded to earlier. These are large problems. These are problems that I think behavioral science hasn't yet taken a center stage at the table. That's changing a little bit now. So we've seen, for example, the World Health Organization adopting a resolution to use behavioral science. And I think during the pandemic, it became abundantly clear that we had a behavioral challenge, right? We, as a civilization, it's remarkable how humankind was able to develop and test and get approved a vaccine in as quickly, in as short a period of time. as we saw them do it. But the challenge was getting that vaccine into people's arms. It was a behavioral problem at the end of it all. Think about misinformation, right? Think about challenges because of the way in which modern social media has changed the nature of engagement. These are, again, all big problems that I wish behavioral science played a bigger role in. And I'm a little, like I say, I'm optimistic that we'll see that happening. But I think we have to go beyond just simply changing forms and changing communication into tackling some of these bigger problems. And then the fifth thing that I think we need to do a lot of work as a community is to think about the ethics, or develop an ethical framework for how to do applied behavioral science well. I think in academia, things are different. There are ethics committees, there are protocols that you write, there are not as obvious conflicts of interest because academia usually tries to learn the truth, and we're trying to just document the evidence. Whereas a company, a for-profit company, might face a trade-off between doing the right thing and doing what is right for them. And so you imagine like a two-dimensional grid. Does an intervention increase the welfare of the organization? Does it make it more profitable or not? On the second dimension, does that same intervention change the welfare of the customer or the stakeholder? Does it make them happier or not? And clearly there's one zone, the top right, which is an intervention that increases the welfare of both the end user and the organization. That's the one that we want to focus on. The one in which you can increase the profit for the company without necessarily making life better or easier or more valuable for your customer. That's a big ethical no-no, but we need a good, robust framework for corporations to use as a guiding star. So all of this to say that I think the science is amazing. I think we have created impact in terms of getting organizations to understand the utility. We've moved now from the first 10, 15 years of growth to maturity that will drive growth. And I think that maturity will only come if we think through how do we best translate our results? How do we prepare organizations? How do we identify specific areas at the first mile where the science can make a difference? How can we broaden the substantive impact of our science? And can we do all of this ethically and reliably? And once we do that, I think behavioral science will become probably as central to any organization as any other science. I'm going to conclude very quickly with one observation, and then we'll turn it over to Junifer to get into the fireside chat piece of today's session, which is Richard Thaler is often asked, when would you consider behavioral economics to be successful? And his usual response is, it is successful when we stop using the term behavioral economics at all, when all of economics becomes behavioral. And I think about it the same way for using behavioral science in organizations, right? When we get to a stage, might happen in 10 years, 15 years, I don't know when we no longer have a behavioral design unit or a behavioral marketing unit, when everything automatically becomes behavioral, becomes scientific, I think we will be successful. So on that note, let me pause and turn it back to Junifer.
Awesome. Thank you, Dilip. That was really great as usual. And thank you so much for your time. By the way, for the folks who have joined in, Dilip has joined in really, really early. So it's early in the morning for him, and we really appreciate you doing this first thing in the morning.
I'll be honest, it's not that early. It's 9 o'clock, so it's not
oh, it's early. 7 in the morning for me. So it's really early for me. Awesome. Cool. So I just wanted to start off the conversation with something you mentioned. So you mentioned that for a while we have been cheerleading and promoting this field a lot. I feel this often happens just before the inflection point of a field. Where do you think behavioral science is now, and where do you think we're heading?
So I'm certainly sympathetic to the fact that cheerleading happens before inflection. I do think we're at the inflection point, right? But I think there's a couple of things that we have to be careful about. So every time you have cheerleading, it brings with you people who understand the science and cheerlead, and people who cheerlead for the sake of cheerlead. They're more interested in promoting themselves, right? And this happens with everything, right? You've seen this happen in HR. There are people who understand what purpose-driven organizations are, and then there are people who want to become known as consultants in purpose-driven organizations. And so there's always that tension between the conversation being dominated by people who are cheerleading for the sake of cheerleading versus the people who truly understand what's going on, right? So I think we're now at that shaking out point. I think we're getting to a point where organizations understand where the science is and where the fluff is. And I do agree. I think we are at inflection. I'm seeing a lot of companies who are now at a much more mature stage of the process. It's no longer about help me change my website. It's about changing processes and fundamentally changing the organization. But it is a slow process. And I'll just build on one other quick thing since you brought this up is when you think about the adoption of innovations like behavioral science more generally, right? Like there are some quick wins that we can all do. And so for us, a quick win would be, you got a product that's kind of struggling and people don't know what to do with it and how to promote it. And so you can put a behavioral lens on it and identify frictions and do an experiment to think about what is the optimal way of promoting it. And that's a quick win because at this point in time, the company is struggling with the product. Or you could think about just like simple behavioral advising. So somebody's in the organization is facing a challenge of how to optimally design communication. And you can come in and say, hang on, here's 2 theories that you should be thinking about, right? So there's a lot of those quick win things that you could do. And of course, all of the last mile stuff we spoke about, right? But it's really, and it's tempting to say, oh, the quick win stuff is no good in the long run. And so let's just focus on the first mile. But you need the quick wins. You need the quick wins to build credibility, and you need them so that people understand the science. And so I think we are now at that stage where the quick wins have done their job, and we are now going to the big stuff. So equally optimistic as you, Junafi, on that.
Awesome. Sounds great. And I totally empathize with the starting off with quick win stuff. And that's usually what I also recommend when someone starts a new behavioral science team in their company, like go for the quick wins first and then attack the bigger problems, because you need to show your credibility there. And then people start listening to you and then you can deal with the bigger problems.
So I do have another quick point observation that I'm going to add to the quick wins stuff, or how do you best embed the science in an organization? And this takes me back to 2015, 2016, when I spent a year at the Government of Canada setting up the Behavioral and Innovation Group. And so we were, at that point in time, obviously, spending a lot of time and energy developing the resources, but we wanted to identify the quick wins. And initially, the team thought that the best quick wins would be aligned with, let's say, the Prime Minister's priorities and or the priorities of a given ministry. And then somebody gave me this invaluable piece of advice, which was don't mess around with any of the priorities, right? If your CEO wants X, stay away from X. If your prime minister wants Y, stay away from Y. And I said, why is that? And the advice that stuck with me to this day is, the moment you stick to a priority area, first, the leader knows what they want done, and they probably also know how they want it done. And so if your experiment kind of shows the leader that maybe their way of thinking about it wasn't right, you're going to get shut down immediately, right? So that's one. And two, and this is especially true in governments, is there will always be detractors, opposition party people who will be waiting for this thing to fail, right? And so stick to safe things. And so we sort of identified completely non-controversial things like, removing sludge. I mean, who doesn't want processes to be simpler? Or digital migration, right? And so those are the kinds of things where we started showcasing with the quick wins. And that's just a piece of advice that I wanted to share with everybody listening in. Stay away from pet projects, at least at the beginning.
Nice. I actually wrote it down. That was nice. So another thing was, again, something I wanted to pick up what you said. So you mentioned how, instead of behavioral design, we need to get to a stage where just design is already incorporating the whole behavioral science in it. And I feel like there's constantly some misalignment there, in the sense that every consultant, including me for that matter, constantly sell the fact that behavioral science is different from pre-existing processes. So we constantly try to differentiate ourselves from what UX researchers do, what consumer insights researchers do, and so on. Like, hey, we're still different. That said, if someone asks you what behavioral science is, how would you put it? And
so can I go back to the point you made about being different? And I think that's an important point to make, but there's a subtle distinction in between being different, therefore we are better than them, versus we're different so we can build on what other people are doing, right? And I think that's the messaging that I always try and communicate when I'm speaking with companies. This is not a substitute, right? We are not in the substitution business. I don't want you to get rid of your design people. We can make it better. And the same thing with research, and the same thing with going to market, and so on and so forth, right? And so to me, I think behavioral science is a good lens that helps us identify problems that we otherwise wouldn't have identified. If you looked at it purely from a mechanistic perspective, it's a science that allows you to incorporate empathy with sort of whoever the stakeholder is, so that you can now start seeing the problems from their perspective, and therefore letting your existing tools tackle a newer set of problems that you couldn't have seen before. Right? So even starting off with behavioral science as a lens to help you identify and reframe problems has been fabulous, because I think that people get, right? But yeah, we often, and I've been guilty of it in the early years, we often kind of pitch it as though this is a better way of doing it than that. I think in academia too, there were some actors that sort of tried to sell the behavioral approach as different from the economics approach, and that just wasn't the right thing to do. I mean, I think that was people like Richard Thaler have shown us that you can actually take good economic theories and look at them from the point of view of the stakeholder, the citizen, the economic agent, do some good behavioral research and incorporate that back into the theory. And I think that's the right way to think about behavioral science.
Right. Yeah. So behavioral science as a lens of seeing things rather than another whole better way of doing it. Nice. Yeah. Cool. Cool. So there's a lot of students watching this. So in terms of career path, what kind of trainings would you recommend to become a better behavioral scientist, or whatever field they do, how do they learn behavioral science so they can use it in whatever they end up doing?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it's a complicated question, because I have gone back and forth on my own opinion on this at several points in time. So I'll tell you what I'm leaning towards. And by the way, as you mentioned, or somebody mentioned earlier, I used to do this BE 101X, which I always would say is a great first entry point for people who know nothing about the science. That doesn't exist anymore, but there's a lot of good books. And I think there's a beautiful course that Rory Sutherland teaches on a platform called 42 courses, I think. But anyway, so there are some online resources. But I think the bigger question has to do with whether we should get people to specialize in behavioral science, or whether behavioral science should be embedded everywhere. And I think I'm rapidly becoming an advocate of the latter. And so oftentimes, like, I get asked by a lot of people why the University of Toronto doesn't start a master's program in behavioral science. And honestly, I don't think that's the right thing to do. Because A, we don't have, and we shouldn't have, a job market that is designed around behavioral science. I think we should have a job market for people in marketing who know behavioral science, and people in finance who know behavioral science, right? And so our approach has been to just like embed it in every possible aspect of the curriculum. But yeah, in the short term, online resources, be part of IBEN. You guys are doing some amazing stuff. And so I think like just even being part of the network and following events and listening to speakers, I think would be a great way of doing it. And then who knows, maybe at some point in time in India, we'll set up some sort of a short-term course. But again, I think like my advice would be to be good at the stuff, at the basic discipline that you want to work in, right? Like you cannot be a behavioral scientist and not know finance and work in a bank. Like that's just not on. And so, yeah, be good at that stuff, and then weave your science into it.
Yeah, 100%. That also sort of aligns with the viewing of behavioral science as a lens, because now you have to be good at something to actually view that through another lens. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Nice. So another question. So you are an academician, but you've also done a lot of applied work, and there's constantly this a lot of people call out that people in academia are not really looking at the real world and are living in their own bubble. So there's a lot of people sometimes hesitate to hire these people as applied folks as well, even folks as PhD and so on, because they're really engraved in the academia world. How would you say someone should transition in a healthy way, given that you already have the experience of doing both?
From academia to industry?
Yeah, and how different you feel it is, and how do you think that transition should happen?
So I'll start off by observing that I got my PhD in the mid-1990s, where academia was different. It was the gap between academia and practice, especially in applied fields like management schools, wasn't as large as it is today, right? And so if you focus just on behavioral science, for example, right? Like a lot of people got the research ideas from practical problems, not from theory. And then the field changed over the last 20, 25 years, and people started getting more theoretical. And so you're right. I think there has been more of an ivory tower culture today than it was before, right? So I think there's a few things I did differently from most of my peers, especially with the last 20, 25 years, is again, I stayed true to problem solving, right? Like if I felt like a research question didn't actually have any implication, I didn't work on it. I mean, that was not my interest, right? And academia has this like strange sort of publish or perish culture, but you have to get good at like publishing enough and not letting it become an obsession, right? So you do enough to get promoted, and you do enough to get tenure, and you do enough that people know about you. But you don't obsess so much about getting papers, because then you tend to get more and more into that ivory tower, and you tend to focus on narrower and narrower problems, right? So that's one. I think two, when I started as a junior faculty member, I kept getting advice, which in hindsight, not even in hindsight, even then I knew was bad advice, right? People would tell me things like, don't focus on teaching, spend all of your time writing papers. Or they would say, Dilip, there'll be times when your dean will come to you and ask you to do a lunchtime talk for corporations. Say no to that, right? Never teach exec ed. And I didn't do any of those things. I was really good at ignoring that advice. And I think a lot of my best work came from those interactions with folks in government and teaching executives. In two ways. One is I built a network of people that kind of knew what I was doing and what the science was about, which otherwise wouldn't have happened. And more importantly, the kind of questions I would get were a basis for some of the work that I did from there on, right? And so like one of my most profound learnings from interacting, like one of these public talks that I did at the Government of Canada about 10, 11 years ago now, was, I was talking about this whole mental accounting budgeting thing and how budgeting can help people make more, or citizens make more prudent choices. And somebody asked me a really practical but a really important question. And the question was, suppose I had $1 million to invest either in a budgeting program or in a standard financial literacy program. What does the research say I should do? Right? And I thought about it and said, research says nothing, right? Because, Junafi, you might be an expert in financial literacy. You spend your entire career studying financial literacy and ways of making it better. And I spend my entire career in budgeting and how to make that better. Never the twain shall meet, right? And so when you think about as a practitioner, like, what are the questions that they're asking? They're asking, where should I invest my money? We don't have research that answers that question, right? And so that's why a lot of the behaviorally informed organization work began, because then we said, look, let's answer the questions that practice needs answers to, as opposed to questions that like make us happier. So yeah, the gaps are large. The gaps are growing, but I think there's enough people have learned the skills of doing enough to be an academic, but spent the time wisely studying practical problems. So again, I'm optimistic on that front too.
Yes. Cool. So I'm going to move on to the next session, but just before that, I have a couple of very short questions. So what are your
yes or no type questions?
No, like slightly longer than that.
Okay.
What are your favorite books in behavioral science? And you can mention your own book as well.
No, so that I have an answer to. There's one that I particularly like, and it's Richard's Misbehaving, 2015. It's a story of, but it's written in a story form, and it's a beautiful book. So if people haven't read it, you should.
Sure, thank you. And another question. So how often do you apply behavioral science in your life? Any fun example that you'd like to share with us?
Oh gosh, all the time, right? Like like basically I have to fool myself into doing things at the right time. I have to. So simple stuff, like even if you've ever got email from me, you will know that most of my email subject lines are questions, because I know from my own research that asking people questions gets them to process information differently than just saying, I have an idea, right? You just say, I have an idea, will you help? ? You're more likely to get a response. So things like, even that, or many years back when my daughter was little, like one of the biggest struggles we used to have in the morning was to get her ready to go out in the winter. And so, those of you who have small children, you tell them, wear your coat so we can go out, and they'll say no, right? And so I just invested in a second coat. So now she had like a red one and a blue one. And every morning I would just ask her, which one today, red or blue? Sidetrack from the question of whether or not she was going to do it in the first place. So yeah, lots of ways of doing it. But yeah, I can go on and on that one.
Nice, sounds good. So Dilip, just a side note, I think your internet's breaking once in a while. So if you can just check that, that'd be great. But yeah, I'll just start reading out a couple of questions. So the first one is, how can a subject that's truly rooted in non-weird countries, I guess they want to know how one can possibly, interpret those results for other developing countries. So, yeah.
No, you don't. The distinction between what happens in a pilot versus what happens in the field applies to translating science across cultures, right? I was a big fan of one thing that the former US President Ronald Reagan always said, which is trust but verify, right? And what I mean by that is I think like a lot of the stuff in behavioral science, the underlying concepts you trust, but the execution, the way things are done, right? That you have to verify, because that's different, right? And so I would say that people are more common across the world than they are different, right? Like you go everywhere in the world, people categorize, people stereotype, people are loss averse. I mean, I've yet to find a culture where people aren't any of those things, right? But how they do it, or what are the specific variables? That's a quick example. In the US, to get people to save more for retirement, a common intervention is to create empathy for your future self. Right? We try to do the same thing in Mexico, and it doesn't work. Right? And it doesn't work because in Mexico, creating empathy for your future self is seen as coming at your family's present expense. And so it's kind of being selfish. But empathy for family's future, yeah, that they'll do, right? And so the unit of analysis for whose empathy is different, but still it's the same, like if you project people in the future, right? And so I think that's what I mean by trust but verify, right? So I think the underlying theory is still the same. but you will need to do some experiments to figure out what's the variable that will get the theory to work. And so to everybody listening, like I'd say never blindly trust anything, like no matter where it's done. Right? Like I've done research in India in sort of one village in Maharashtra. You go to a different village and you don't get the same result.
Totally different results, yeah.
Right? So it's not about weird versus not weird. It's just about like just having the discipline to test every single time.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So another question, I actually really like this question. So is behavioral scientist going to exist as a standalone position in tech industry? And I do have my opinion, but yeah.
Yeah, you probably have a better answer to this question than I do, actually, Shanafi. What's yours?
I sort of see behavioral scientists as this transitioning folks who just come in and, develop a culture and then leave. So I don't think behavioral scientists should stay in a company for more than a year. And if they are and they're doing great work, that means they're doing a terrible job at what they're supposed to do. Yeah. So I would just say they just come and train all the folks to think in a more behavioral sciencey way. And then, I think that's how
I go back to the, unless it's embedded into the way the company does stuff. There shouldn't be a standalone behavioral science position anywhere eventually, I think. Right. So we work with a large bank over here, and initially the group was called Behavioral Finance and Wealth Advisory or something like that. And now they've just dropped the behavioral thing because everything they do is now informed by behavioral science. That's, by the way, the first example of something like that. But yeah, I'm with you.
Cool. So another question, how do we convince colleagues from other verticals who rely on their own experience in dealing with humans about the importance of behavioral science?
I'll tell you how I've done it. Is A, data, and B, predictions. Right. Mm-hmm. And so the same company that I just mentioned, whose name I won't mention, they were doing this advertising campaign online. And so I was in a meeting with one of them. And the person, so I asked them, like, how do you come up with the messaging for this stuff? And we pay an agency $1 million and they produce this. And so so I said, okay, that's great. But can we experiment? I said, if you want to, you can, but it's just like, it's pointless because these guys know what they're doing, right? And so the agency came up with like 3 different concepts. We asked everybody in that marketing team to make a prediction as to which of these 3 concepts would be the best, and gave them a 4th option, none of the above. Right? And so everybody chose one of the 3. They had their favorites. I was the only one who chose none of the above. And so we did an experiment. We actually used a conjoint-ish type design, unlike conjoint, which is within participants. This one was across. And so different people got served different versions of the ad. We created all kinds of different ads. And it was something that was not even in the original concept. That turned out to be like a runaway success compared to everything else, right? And I think that's how people kind of figured out. Like in hindsight, everything seems obvious, right? But I think really having the discipline to ask people to predict and then showing them that, sometimes not just their prediction, but even mine was wrong. That's powerful.
Right. That often like puts us in our spot of, hey, you don't know everything.
It does. And it's like, this is the other thing too. It's like oftentimes when I go to companies and I say, look, I don't know the answer. Like, I don't know what the correct answer is, but I can help you find out what the correct thing is. And I can also tell you that correct thing is true today and for this problem, and it may not be true tomorrow and for a different problem. Right. Yeah. And so just like having that discipline for testing again. Get people to predict. You make a prediction, show that you're all wrong, and the science is better than all of you. Is a reliable way of doing it.
That's like very, very true. And sometimes companies ask for an ROI on, hey, what are we going to get out of this behavioral science consultancy? And I usually tell them, hey, I can give you a number, but it's going to be a cooked up number and it's not going to tell you anything about what's actually going to turn up, right?
That's true.
So yeah, it's so important to test. And yes. Another question, I'm guessing it's from someone who's studying behavioral science. So behavioral science is multidisciplinary as an entrant. How do we go about building a proficiency in the various disciplines that constitute it?
So it's a good question. I think like the same idea that I mentioned about applied behavioral science holds true for behavioral science more generally, which is find the home discipline, right? Like yours could be social psych, mine could be cognitive, but be rooted in one of those things and then branch out. That's one. I think the other thing that I'm going to highlight is methods. Is it's really important to understand multiple methods, not just the ones that are typically used in your subpart of psychology or behavioral science. And I think that's where our biggest contribution to the field can be, is to apply different methods and not just like borrow results that exist from one particular method. But yeah, find a home and then just like go overboard on methods. Like that to me is the key. I also encourage like people who are students to like read broadly, right? And I mean, by that I mean not like not broadly within psychology, but also even more broadly, right? For example, a lot of my research and practical ideas have come from reading novels, right? Milan Kundera, or even Harry Potter, for that matter. Like I've actually got a paper based on Harry Potter that I've actually used now for interventions in some other stuff. You know, like the Goblet of Fire, Junafi, there was that thing where Harry woke up after Christmas and realized that the Triwizard Cup was just like 3 months away or something like that. The day before Christmas, he hadn't realized that, right? And so the intuition that I got from it was essentially people compartmentalize time, right? Like there's these major markers, right? And if you get people to do something that is due in this period, they're more likely to get it done. If it's due in the next period, they don't think about it till that marker passes by, right? So we actually did some work in India too, right? Like basically timing matters. You ask people to make contributions this year, they make it. If you ask them it's due next year, then they procrastinate, right? So Harry Potter can be a source of ideas. The point is like read broadly, read other kinds of disciplines. So if you're a psychologist, read economics so that you understand how the world thinks differently.
Yeah, just want to add one small thing to it. Like also just look around you, because there are people all around you, and that's behavioral science, right? Just observe all their behavior. Think about why are we doing what we are doing? Why did I not do it yesterday? Why am I doing it today? And when you start asking a lot of these questions, it just becomes really, really fun. And that's why this field is really enjoyable, at least to me.
No, for sure, right? And as a grad student, that's what I did. I used to have this, like back in those days, little pocketbook, and I still have it, and my kids laugh at it and say, why didn't you just record it on your device? And it's like, there were no devices. But yeah, just like jot down stuff. Like, I wonder why people do that.
And taking one last question, which also builds upon your last comment on methods. Someone asked what I want to know more about the type of experiments used in behavioral science. And they want to know something apart from quoting them, surveys and focus groups. So maybe if you could just mention a couple of methods that might be enlightening for folks.
Yeah, so I will say that in the behavioral sciences, we have long considered randomized controlled trials as quote unquote the gold standard. I put it quote unquote because I don't believe that. But there are so you could do a randomized controlled trial, which is in the field, you try and create variation. You could do lab experiments, which are bringing the same thing into either a hypothetical or an incentive compatible setting in a lab. You could do focus groups, you could do surveys, but if you can embed the philosophy of an experiment, which is treatment and control, that's great, right? And so in surveys too, for example, I've done surveys where half the people randomly get one version of a survey, which is framed differently, for example, than the other one, or focus groups where people see different versions of either a product or a policy, and they're asked to think about how that stuff would work. That's fabulous. There are newer methods. So, there's econometric methods today where you can use difference approaches with archive data. You can do something called propensity score matching, which is look at sort of the demographic information that you have about people and explain away differences in subgroups that might be caused by demographics to see if there's a residual effect. And then the one that I'm like really excited about nowadays is a method called synthetic control, where you can model agents and you can do basically what if kind of experiments without ever doing an experiment. Not without ever doing an experiment, but not doing the full experiment. So yeah, there's a lot of different methods.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you so much, Dilip. And with that, we're coming to the end of this session. So just a quick overview. This is one of the 3 events that we have planned. The next one is going to be a Najathon, a behavioral science hackathon, which will happen over the course of 1 week. It's going to be really fun. And after that, we have a corporate/academic conference coming up in September. So folks, do stay tuned. And I'm going to pass it on to Bhushan, who's going to quickly thank everyone involved and Dilip. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jinofi and Professor Dilip and Jinofi. I think this is a fabulous webinar. And I think I was, absolutely writing tons of notes all through that. It's rare, I think, in webinar where people typically just dole out stuff that is anywhere available online. So I think this was absolutely gripping. So, formally starting off the vote of thanks, Professor Dilip, thank you so much for joining. And I think this has been, I think we've discussed this couple of months back, and you very, very happily gave us this time. For all those listeners who haven't picked up his book, The Last Mile, please do pick it up. Fabulous, focus on the applied behavioral sciences. And I think, Professor, one of the big things that I'm going to take back is, how do we prepare organizations to balance the business needs with the scientific evidence? Us the platform really to democratize, behavioral economics, behavioral sciences, not just among students, but also, in democratize in public in general, right? The next and perhaps the most important, crucial people that we need to thank is Jumur ma'am and Jinofi, both of whom are on camera now. Sort of the pillar of the entire journey that we're going to, we just begun today, and it's going to continue for the next 2 months. Jumur ma'am is the HOD at SJCC, leads the Department of Economics, and Jinofi, of course, as I'm sure everybody here knows, leads IBM as well as her new venture, Beyond Nudge Consulting. I would also like to thank here our co-organizers and advisors, Vishal from IISc and Ritvik at IIMB. Both are professors of the respective departments in those places. And the next up, I think, is the team at SJCC. Perhaps absolutely very, very wonderful bunch of kids, very, very energetic trio that we are working with, and really at the back end working on this seamlessly. Netra, Niladri, and Mahit, and of course the tech team at both SJCC and IIM for getting this sorted. Before we wind up, students, just a reminder, we are having our Najathon coming up in the next couple of weeks. The posters are on LinkedIn, and soon it might also be up on your respective college, notice boards, etc. So do register for it, and the rules are on the poster. It's a very exciting topic. Of course, can't reveal much, but the Najathon also happens in a beautiful campus of IISc in Bangalore. If you haven't visited, this might be a good excuse as well. And yeah, I think with that, we'll wind up. So we hope this session was a step towards moving behavioral science, as Professor said, from the last mile to the first mile, but within the ethical frameworks. So that's really what we're hoping for. Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening. Bye, or great day.